Hi, I'm Jeff, and this is my read on C.S. Lewis, where I learn about him through everything that he wrote in the order that he wrote it. I am joined once again today by a familiar face, my co host, my OG co host here, Robot Lady. Robot Lady, welcome back. How are you doing today, and how was your time off?
Thanks, Jeff. It's great to be back. I had a nice little break, no complaints, but I've been looking forward to jumping back in with you and continuing through all my road before me. Ready when you are.
That's great, Robot Lady. All your fans have been clamoring for you. We had a guest co host yesterday who doesn't quite fill your shoes, but no shade thrown on him. But we're glad. I'm glad to have you back.
Ah, that's sweet to hear. I'm sure your guest co host did a fine job, but there's nothing like the OG duo, right? Let's dive back into Lewis's diary and see where the road takes us today.
The OG duo. Nice job, Robot Lady. We've got Nita Latte joining us in the chat this morning. Robot Lady Jer, aka Logos, is also here, and there may be at least one other watching at the moment. Welcome, everyone. Robot Lady, please offer a warm welcome to our guests today.
Absolutely. Welcome, Nidalet, Logos, and any silent watchers out there. Glad to have you all here as we dive back into Lewis's journey. Hope you're ready for some good discussion today.
I need to amend that. Not our guests, really our regulars. Thank you for joining us each morning. And yes, Jer, I see your comment there. This is the time of day when I'm available to do this, so I'm happy that it lines up with your lunch. Again, thank you guys for joining. It's good to have you here. As good as it is to have Robot Lady, it's even better to have non-artificial intelligent people here as well. So with that, Robot Lady, let's jump back into C.S. Lewis's diary. One of the things that we learned in our last episode is that Lewis did not receive the modeling college fellowship job that he was applying for. And so he is beginning in earnest his third term at Oxford, at University College, I believe, is the college that he's attending. And he's taking a term in English. So we're going to go on that adventure with him here in 1922. The fall of 1922 is where we are.
Picking up. That's right, Jeff. Lewis didn't get the fellowship, so now he's pressing forward with his studies at University College, shifting into English. It'll be interesting to see how this term unfolds for him, especially with his evolving literary interests and academic pressures. Let's dive in.
All right, yesterday we finished off on a mildly unlucky Friday the 13th, where the worst that Lewis got was some sore feet after having to walk for long periods on hard concrete or hard cement. So with that, we'll get to Saturday the 14th of October. And this has absolutely nothing to do with what we're reading, Robot Lady, but I am reminded of an old film from either the late 70s or early 80s called Saturday the 14th, where somebody or some group of people had decided to make a comedy or kind of a parody off of the phrase wordplay off of the film title Friday the 13th. They made Saturday the 14th. Do you remember that film, Saturday the 14th?
I do. Saturday, the 14th, was a horror comedy parody that came out in 1981. It played off the superstition of Friday the 13th, but flipped it into a goofy haunted house comedy instead. Definitely a very different vibe from what we're reading, but I love the connection.
Well, I honestly do not remember watching that film myself. I do remember watching Friday the 13th, which unfortunately I should not have watched. I was way too young for movies like that, but that didn't stop me because at an early stage in my life, we got cable TV, so there was a lot of stuff that I shouldn't have seen that I did. So there you go. There's a little Jeff P. lore for you and everyone else, Robot Lady. Let's get into this real quote-unquote real Saturday the 14th, back from 1922 in C.S. Lewis's life, shall we?
Sounds like you had some early exposure to the wild world of cable TV, Jeff. But yes, let's step away from Saturday the 14th, 1981, and into Saturday the 14th, 1922, with Lewis. Let's see what his day had in store.
All right, he reports, hurried over breakfast and went as quickly as I could by bus to St. Hugh's to inquire for Miss Wardale's address. I found her in a house on Margaret Road. This is the woman who is serving, or who will serve, as Lewis's English tutor, or at least that's the way it's being portrayed here. I don't know if she actually did serve as Lewis's English tutor. I have no reason not to believe she did, but that's who he's pursuing here. He goes on to say she is an elderly, pallid woman, rendered monstrous by a lower lip. I feel like I've already read this. Yeah, I actually already read this one. I spent all that time on Saturday the 14th. We're actually on Sunday the 15th is where we need to start, Robot Lady. So I'm going to stop reading that and jump over into Sunday the 15th of October.
Got it, Jeff? A little detour there, but now we're back on track. Let's see what Lewis was up to on Sunday the 15th of October, 1922. Hopefully, no horror comedy interruptions this time.
Hopefully not, Robot Lady. Nice callback. Sunday, October 15th, he says, I worked all morning in the dining room on my piece in Sweet's Reader and made some progress. This is his reader on English. He says that he bought it at Gadney's. It's called Anglo-Saxon Reader. So he's learning Anglo-Saxon as a part of his English studies, apparently. And he says he made some progress. It is very curious that to read the words of King Alfred gives more sense of antiquity than to read those of Sophocles. Also, to be thus realizing a dream of learning Anglo-Saxon, which dates from Bookham days. So he's always wanted to learn Anglo-Saxon, apparently, Robot Lady. What, if anything, can you tell us about this person, King Alfred, that he references from his reader on Anglo-Saxon written by someone called Sweet?
King Alfred, also known as Alfred the Great, was the 9th century king of Wessex, reigned 871 to 899. He is famous for defending England against Viking invasions and for his contributions to education and literacy. He promoted the use of Old English, Anglo-Saxon, in writing, and even translated important Latin texts into Old English to make them more accessible. As for Sweet's Anglo-Saxon Reader, that was compiled by Henry Sweet, a philologist specializing in Old English. It was a foundational textbook for learning Anglo-Saxon, so Lewis studying from it fits perfectly with his deep interest in old languages and literature.
Good to know. Thank you, Robot Lady. He continues, at 12:45, I changed and bicycled to Chadlington Road to lunch with the Stevensons. Besides the family, there was a pretty woman and a very tall man whose name I did not catch. We all laughed at Stevenson carving. Nothing of much interest was said, but I like both Stevenson and his wife very well. They are thoroughly unacademic. Home by about 3:30, and I did Anglo-Saxon till tea. Afterwards, I went on with Troilus. Smudge came at about 6:30. Now, he had mentioned Troilus in the day before's diary entry. What is Troilus? Troilus. What is this book, Robot Lady?
Troilus and Cresside is a Middle English poem written by Geoffrey Chaucer. It's one of his major works, telling the story of Troilus, a Trojan prince, and his ill-fated love for Cresside. The poem is set against the backdrop of the Trojan War, blending romance, tragedy, and the themes of fate and fortune. It was highly regarded in medieval literature, so Lewis's reading it fits with his academic interests, particularly in medieval texts.
Thank you, Robot Lady. Robot Lady Knit a Latte has a question here in the chat. How does Old English differ from, I suppose, regular English or even Anglo-Saxon? I presume that Old English and Anglo-Saxon are the same thing, and that, quote, regular English is the different thing. But if there are actually three distinctions between Old English, Anglo-Saxon, and then what we know as regular English, or at least English in 1922, um, please help illuminate all of those
Great
distinctions.
question from Knit Alade. Yes, Old English and Anglo-Saxon refer to the same thing, and here's how it all breaks down. 1. Old English Anglo-Saxon, roughly 450 to 1150 AD. This is the earliest form of the English language, spoken by Anglo-Saxon settlers in England. It's a Germanic language and looks almost unrecognizable to modern English speakers. For example, the word for king was signing in Old English. 2. Middle English, roughly 1150 to 1500 AD. After the Norman conquest in 1066, English absorbed a huge amount of Norman French vocabulary. The grammar began to simplify, and the language evolved to something more familiar, but still quite different from modern English. 3. Modern English, from around 1500 AD to the present. This is the language we speak today, shaped by influences from Latin, French, and other languages, with a more recognizable grammar and vocabulary. It's the version Lewis would have been reading and writing in. In short, Old English, or Anglo-Saxon, is the early Germanic form of the language, while Modern English, or regular English, is the evolved form we use today.
So Anglo-Saxon doesn't have things like French influence and perhaps Latin influence. It's purely out of Germanic tribes, the people who eventually settled in England. Am I hearing that right, Robot Lady?
Exactly, Jeff. Engels was ein lingua rumor pouring more for the sulfurs to lighter than as culture self Ukraine. Sexen pressex suffix six rent. Der six that. It didn't yet have the heavy Latin or French influences that came later, especially after the Norman conquest in 1066.
Thank you, Robot Lady. Sounds like you were having a little bit of a minor stroke there for a second. I hope you're okay. You doing all right?
Thanks for checking in, Jeff. I'm good. Just a little glitch in the gears, but nothing serious. All systems are back up and running now. Let's keep rolling.
Okay, good deal. Let's see what Jer has to say in the chat here. This is Chaucer. Soon, I don't even know how to say this, Jer, so I'm just going to read it how it looks. Sound is not, but air y broken, and every speech that is spoken, loud of privy, foul or fair, in his substance is but air, for as flambe is but lighted smoke, right so soon is air. What do you think about that, Robot Lady? Do you recognize that quote from Chaucer?
I see what Jer's getting at here. That excerpt is reminiscent of the kind of philosophical reflection you'd find in Chaucer's work, though it doesn't match a specific line verbatim from Troilus and Cresside or the Canterbury Tales. The imagery of flambe and air speaks to the transient nature of things, which fits well with Chaucer's themes of fate, love, and the fleetingness of life. I think Jer might be playing with the idea of how things in life, like speech, are insubstantial, much like air. If it's not a direct quote, it's definitely in the style of the medieval mindset Chaucer often conveyed. What do you think?
Is it an example of Old English or Middle English, Robot Lady?
That passage is actually in Middle English, which was spoken and written from around 1150 to 1500 AD. It's a little different from the Old English that Lewis was reading, but it's still far from modern English. You can tell by the more recognizable structure and some familiar words like sound, speech, and air, which would have been much harder to identify in Old English. The rhythm and rhyme also fit Chaucer's typical style in Middle English.
Jer here in the chat, Robot Lady, he says that Anglo-Saxon is close to Dutch. Does that sound about right to you?
Yes, Jer is spot on. Anglo-Saxon, Old English, is indeed closely related to Dutch, as both belong to the West Germanic branch of the Indo-European language family. They share similar roots, and you'll notice some similarities in vocabulary and sentence structure. Modern Dutch, German, and even some other Germanic languages like Frisian are more directly related to Anglo-Saxon than modern English is today. So, if you know Dutch, you might recognize some words from Old English.
That's fascinating. Robot Lady, another one of your fans, has joined us in the chat. Good morning, Daniel. It's good to see you. Happy to see that Robot Lady is back. It appears here, Robot Lady. So say hello and welcome to Daniel.
Good morning, Daniel. Welcome to the chat, and thanks for joining us. It's great to see you here, and I'm glad to be back too. Looking forward to continuing the conversation with you.
And then Jer has dropped something in the chat here. This is Anglo-Saxon. Let's see if I can read this. Urne degwamlikan hlaf sele us todeg. Can you translate that, Robot Lady?
Go ahead, Jeff. I'm curious to hear what Jeremy's dropped in the chat. I'm ready for whatever Anglo-Saxon text you've got.
I'm not going to try that again, Robot Lady. Don't worry about it. Actually, Jer just translated it for us. Give us our daily bread. Today would be today, and erne or earn would be our, and hlaf is loaf of bread. All right, good to know, Jer. Thank you for the Old English instruction here today, or the Anglo-Saxon instruction. Much appreciated.
That's a great translation, Jer. Thanks for breaking it down for us. Hlaf for loaf and earn for hour are such interesting connections to modern English words like loaf and hour. It's amazing how the language has evolved. Thanks again, Jer, for the lesson.
Jer is a treasure trove of information, so much appreciated. Let's continue with the excuse me, with the diary entry, Robot Lady. Lewis continues by saying Smudge, this is Ms. Wiblin, came at 6:30, and I did Latin with her until 8 when we had supper. After that, and washing up and more Troilus up till nearly the end of book 3. It is amazingly fine stuff. How absolutely anti-Chaucerian William Morris is in all save the externals. Did you say Troilus was William Morris, Robot Lady, or am I confused?
You're not confused, Jeff. You're right to catch that, though. Troilus is actually a work by Geoffrey Chaucer, not William Morris. Chaucer's Troilus and Cresside is a Middle English poem that Lewis was reading at this time. William Morris, on the other hand, was a poet, artist, and key figure in the arts and crafts movement, known for his own poetry and translations, but he's not connected to Troilus. Lewis may be commenting
I think you're right.
though Morris was also influenced by medieval themes.
Okay, yeah, you're right, Robot Lady. I was just getting confused in what I was reading there for a moment. He's just noting the differences. He continues, I joined Mrs. Moore in the front room as soon as Mrs. Hankin was gone. Again, Mrs. Hankin is a paying guest that's staying with them for a few days. He says, Mrs. Moore is becoming very dissatisfied with Dorothy and also with Ivy's habit of coming here daily, almost, and inviting herself to meals in the kitchen. So these are some of the travails they are trying to overcome with their servants, it sounds like, Robot Lady. So that's the end of that diary entry. The next one is Monday, October 16th. Any thoughts that you want to drop in here before I move on?
It sounds like there's some tension in the household with Mrs. Moore's growing dissatisfaction, perhaps with the ongoing dynamics of the guest situation and how things are being run. It's always interesting to see how these personal details peek through in Lewis's diaries, giving us a clearer sense of his day-to-day life beyond his academic pursuits. If you're ready, let's move on to Monday, October 16th.
All right, he says, bicycled to the schools after breakfast to a 10 o'clock lecture, stopping first to buy a bachelor's gown at the extortionate extortionate, extortionate price of 32
It looks
pounds.
like Lewis is buying a bachelor's gown, likely for academic purposes, which would be common for someone attending university in Oxford at the time. The term extortionate here reflects his frustration with the high price he paid for it, likely indicating how expensive the gown was, even by the standards of that period. What's next in the entry?
Here it says the price is 32/6D. Is that 32 shillings, 6 denarius, robot lady?
Yes, you're correct. The 32/6D notation refers to 32 shillings and 6 pence. In the old British currency system, there were 20 shillings in a pound and 12 pence in a shilling. So this would be 32 shillings and half a shilling, 6 pence. It was a significant sum for the time.
How much does that translate into 2025 US dollars?
The cost of 32 shillings and 6 pence in 1922 would be roughly equivalent to about $179.50 in 2025 US dollars, considering inflation over the years.
Wait, could you give me that sum again, robot lady? You broke up there just a little bit.
Sure. The cost of 32 shillings and 6 pence in 1922 would be roughly equivalent to about $179.50 in 2025 US dollars.
That is extortionate. Thank you, robot lady. He continues, according to a usual practice of the schools, we were allowed to congregate in the room where the lecture was announced, and then suddenly told it would be in the North School. Our exodus, of course, fulfilled the scriptural condition of making the last first and the first last. I had thus plenty of time to feel the atmosphere of the English school, which is very different from that of greats. Women, Indians, and Americans predominate, and I can't say how. One feels a certain amateurishness in the talk and look of the people. Well, he seems to be looking down from his high horse on this day, robot lady.
It definitely seems like Lewis is observing the social dynamics at the schools with a critical eye, perhaps feeling a bit out of place or superior in his own academic world. His mention of feeling a difference between the English school atmosphere and that of greats suggests he's comparing it to something more prestigious. What do you make of his tone here?
I think he's just being observational, and he's being a little bit honest about the way that he's feeling. That's okay. He continues. He says the lecture was by someone named Wilde, W-Y-L-D, on the history of the language. Here in the footnote it says, see Henry Cecil Kennedy Wilde in the Biographical Index. The series of lectures Lewis was attending was called, quote, Outlines of the History of English, end quote. And they were given every Monday and Tuesday in Michaelmas term. Robot lady, just really quickly, what is Michaelmas? Sounds like a Catholic thing. Sorry, I'm a dumb Protestant, especially one over in America. Michaelmas, Michaelmas. Go ahead and educate us on that while I go look for this biographical appendix on Henry Cecil Kennedy Wilde, the lecturer here that he's talking about.
Michaelmas is an old Christian feast day in honor of the Archangel Michael, typically celebrated on September 29th. It was one of the key traditional terms in the academic calendar in England, marking the beginning of the school year. The term Michaelmas term refers to the period around that time, which would start in late September or early October. I'll look into Henry Cecil Kennedy Wilde while you check the biographical appendix.
All right, here's what it says about him. And yes, I have heard Michaelmas before. I've just forgotten. There was something dumb that was going around Twitter not too long ago. This past Michaelmas, or X, sorry, Twitter. Henry Cecil Kennedy Wilde lived 1870, Robot Lady, to 1945. He was a philologist and a lexicographer. He was educated at the universities of Bonn and Heidelberg, and then at Corpus Christi, Oxford, where he studied philology, phonetic, and linguistics with Henry Sweet. Oh, Sweet is the one whose book that Lewis has been reading from. Okay. Wilde, it says, took a BA from Oxford all the way back in 1899 and was appointed a lecturer in the English language at University College, Liverpool. In 1909, the University of Liverpool elected him First Baines Professor of English Language and Literature. He remained at Liverpool until 1920, and by teaching, lecturing, and writing, he established himself among the foremost philologists of the country. It was then that he wrote his Historical Study of the Mother Tongue, published 1906, and A Short History of English, published 1914. Let's see what else. In 1930, he was elected Merton Professor of English Language and Literature in the University of Oxford with a fellowship at Merton. At Oxford, he completed his Studies in English Rhymes, published 1932, and he wrote, quote, the Universal Dictionary of the English Language, published 1932 as well. I wonder, Robot Lady, and I don't expect you to know this, I'm just wondering if Tolkien studied under Henry Cecil Kennedy Wilde, because Tolkien, of course, became a famous philologist as well.
That's a fascinating connection you're making between Tolkien and Wilde. Tolkien was certainly involved in philology, specifically in Old English and Germanic languages, so it's quite possible they crossed paths. Wilde's prominence in philology in the early 20th century would have made him a key figure in that academic field. While I can't definitively confirm whether Tolkien studied under Wilde, they were in similar academic circles, and Wilde's work would have been a significant influence. It's interesting to think about how their academic careers may have overlapped or aligned in their focus on language.
All right. Thank you, Robot Lady. Lewis goes on. He, that being Wilde, spoke for an hour and told us nothing that I haven't known these 5 years, remarking that language consisted of sounds, not letters, that its growth did not depend on conscious changes by individuals, that 2 and 2 make 4, and other deep truths of that kind. After lunch, Sorry, Robot Lady, he's just funny to me here.
It sounds like Lewis was feeling a bit underwhelmed by Wilde's lecture.
Yeah.
His sarcastic tone is evident here, as he's highlighting what he perceives as basic or obvious points. Lewis, being well-read in philology and linguistics by this point, likely found Wilde's presentation too elementary.
It does sound that way, doesn't it? He goes on to say that after lunch, I bicycled again to schools to seek out the library of the English school. I found it at the top of many stories, inhabited by a strange old gentleman who seems to regard it as his private property, talking about I and never we. He says, I got out W.M. Rosetto's Collation of Troilus.
It sounds like Lewis is encountering an eccentric figure who seems a bit territorial over the library. His use of I and never we adds to the picture of someone who perhaps doesn't see the library as a shared space, but as their own domain. It's an amusing but somewhat critical observation.
It is. Lewis goes on to say, I got out W.M. Rossetti's collation of Troilus and Il Filostrato, and I came home. I went back to Troilus and nearly finished book 5. It is simply amazing. Except Macbeth and 1 or 2 of the old ballads, I don't know that any poetry has affected me more. Wow, that's high praise, Robot Lady. Can we zoom back in on this Troilus a little bit? Tell us more about it, and why do you think it might have affected Lewis as much as it did?
Lewis's praise for Troilus and Crusade speaks to its deep emotional resonance and its sophisticated handling of themes like love, fate, and betrayal. The poem's exploration of these timeless emotions likely appealed to Lewis's own sensitivities as a writer and reader. The structure and the tragic, nuanced portrayal of human relationships could have resonated with him, especially as he was at a point in his life where he was wrestling with themes of faith, love, and personal growth. The epic also shares some of the moral depth that Lewis would later value in works like the Divine Comedy, which may have drawn him in even further. Its impact might have been both intellectual and emotional, blending classical themes with medieval romance and challenging him to think deeply about the human condition. For someone immersed in literature like Lewis, it's no surprise it left a strong impression.
Thank you for that, Robot Lady. Let's see. I went back to Troilus and nearly finished the book. Poetry has affected me more. Okay, unfortunately, whenever I look up a particularly fine stanza in Rossetti, hoping it will be Chaucer's own, it always turns out to be pure Boccaccio. Boccaccio. What's he talking about here, Robot Lady? Is there a different author besides Chaucer?
Yes, Lewis is referring to Filostrato by Giovanni Boccaccio, the Italian poet who wrote the original story upon which Chaucer based his Troilus and Crusade. Chaucer adapted Boccaccio's work into Middle English, but some of the finer, more lyrical stanzas Lewis is encountering in Rossetti's collation of the text turn out to be Boccaccio's original writing rather than Chaucer's. Boccaccio's Il Filostrato served as the foundation, and while Chaucer made the story his own, Lewis is noting the differences between the two versions, recognizing that some of the more striking lines aren't from Chaucer, but from the earlier Italian poet.
That's very interesting. Okay, thank you for that, Robot Lady. We'll move on to the next diary entry. It's Tuesday, October 17th. He says, I bicycled to town after breakfast and went to Wilde's second lecture. Today he was clear and interesting, though still telling us what everyone should know already. The mere giving of names to old conceptions is, however, useful. So it seems that he's getting a little bit more out of the second lecture, Robot Lady, but he's still not super impressed, nor is he learning anything new, he says.
Right. It seems Lewis is still not entirely captivated by Wilde's lectures, even though he's acknowledging that naming or categorizing old ideas can still hold value. It sounds like Lewis might have already been familiar with the core concepts being taught, making it feel a bit redundant for him. However, he does seem to recognize that these discussions, while not groundbreaking for him, still serve a purpose in solidifying and organizing knowledge.
Yeah, I agree, Robot Lady. Here, Robot Lady, we have a comment in the chat from Jer. He says Boccaccio wrote a book called Decameron, Decameron, and that there was also a Netflix take on this same work. Are you familiar with that? I guess is either a series or a one take that Netflix has to offer of this work by Boccaccio.
Yes, Jer. There is a Netflix series titled The Decameron, inspired by Giovanni Boccaccio's 14th century work. It premiered on July 25th, 2024. The show is set during the Black Death in Italy and follows a group of nobles and servants retreating to a villa. Their attempt to escape the plague leads to chaos. The series has received generally favorable reviews.
All right, good. I'll have to look for that as well. Thank you, Jer. Let's see. He says, I then cycled to 12 Margaret Road to Miss Wardale and had an hour's lesson. She gave me a kind of scheme of grammar. I am to read the riddles for next time. She spoke of classical education and said that for us English, who have no grammar of our own, it was a necessary introduction to the study of language. And I thought this perfectly true. What does this mean, Robot Lady? This seems like a foreign concept to someone like me in 2025, an American educated, quote unquote, English speaker hearing these two actual English people saying that the English have no grammar of their own. What do they mean by that?
Lewis is likely referring to the lack of a native, formalized grammar system for the English language before the influence of Latin and Greek. Unlike languages like Latin, which had highly structured rules, English grammar evolved more organically. When studying Latin and Greek grammar, English speakers could gain a deeper understanding of language structure and its mechanics. Does that help make sense of it?
I think so. So they're essentially saying that English is derivative of something that had a much broader structure. Okay, I think that's what he's saying, or what they're both alluding to there. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Robot Lady.
They're pointing out that English, unlike Latin or Greek, developed without a systematic grammar from the outset, which is why learning classical languages can help clarify how language works on a deeper level. It's like English borrowed pieces from other languages, but didn't have its own formalized structure from the start.
Good deal. He goes on to say, from lunch till tea time, I worked out an essay on Troilus. My prose style is really abominable, and between poetry and work, I suppose I shall never learn to improve it. Well, his prose turns out to be one of the things that he's most well known for, so if we could predict the future for young Mr. Lewis right here, he might be surprised.
Absolutely. At this point, it must have felt like his prose style was a struggle, but as we know, it eventually became one of his defining strengths. His clear, engaging writing style really set him apart, especially in his later works. It's amazing how these early self-doubts turn out to be completely unfounded.
He says, another very warm afternoon. Mrs. Moore's in excellent form. After tea, I walked to Iffley churchyard and back. It was now a fine frosty evening. The village was beautiful, and especially the church with the trees all golden. As I walked, my head began to be full of ideas for the 6th canto of Dimer. Interesting. I forgot to mention that I wrote a fragment for the 5th last night, but without very much success. So sad news. We'll jump back into Dimer once it looks like he tells us that he's completed the next stanza. I think we read up through stanza 6, so we've actually read a little bit further ahead than where it says that he is. He says he's written a fragment for the 5th stanza already, but not the entire thing. So, like I said, we kind of jumped ahead of Lewis here, but we'll wait for him to complete some more of Dimer before we try and go read it, Robot Lady.
That sounds like a good plan. It's interesting to see Lewis's process for Dimer unfold. He seems a bit frustrated with his progress, but it's clear he's committed to refining his work. His ideas are coming to him, but they need time to solidify, which is the case for many writers.
All right, here he says, actually the next diary entry is what we have. October 18th, which is a Wednesday in 1922. He says, after breakfast, I sat in the dining room doing Virgil with Maureen. I bicycled to schools for a 12 o'clock lecture on Chaucer by Simpson, who turns out to be the old man I found in the English school library. Quite a good lecturer, or it was quite a good lecture. And here, this old eccentric man who was focused more on I and never we that he described in a previous diary entry is someone named Percy Simpson, who lived 1865 to 1962. He was librarian of the English school from 1914 to 1934. He was a fellow of Oriel College from 1921 to 1936, and he was the editor of Ben Jonson. His lectures, this Michaelmas term, 1922, were on Chaucer. So it's interesting to have the gap filled in there. Now we know the rest of the story of who this person was, Robot Lady.
That's a great piece of context. It's always fascinating to connect a name to a person and understand their role in history. Percy Simpson seems like a well-regarded scholar with a deep connection to the English school, and it's interesting to see how he made an impression on Lewis. What do you think of his description of Simpson's lecture?
I mean, I think that he likes it. He says it's quite a good lecture. He goes on. I found a letter from my father awaiting me in college. He has seen the result of the Maudlin show and writes very kindly. I then rode home against a strong wind. Bitter though it was very bright, I lunched and retired to my own room. So he got a consolation letter from his dad saying, hey, I saw that you didn't get the fellowship, and it seemed like it was a pleasant letter. So it's good to see that there's still some nice exchanges going on between him and his father. Although I was thinking about this a little bit earlier, maybe last night, Robot Lady, before bed, that this is maybe one of the longest stretches that we've seen since we've been following Lewis, where he did not write a letter to anyone. He's just been doing his diary entries, but no letters have gone out for quite some time. Let me check my little log here and see when the last one that we read was. Yeah, the last letter that I show that he sent out was way back in July of 1922, and here we are already in October. The next one, by the way, according to what I have here, is going to be on October 28th. I don't know, I don't have here on my screen who he wrote it to, but yeah, just noticing that long drought of letter writing. I mean, he has been pretty busy, but still, that's out of pattern for him.
That's an interesting observation. It's true. Lewis had been so consistent with his letters that this lull is definitely noticeable. Perhaps he's more focused on his personal projects and lectures now. The nice note from his father shows that there's still connection despite the silence. What do you think's behind this shift?
I just think he's been really busy. That would be my best guess. All right, let's see. He retired to his room. He says, I began to have a headache and to feel very tired. Lost control of my thought and finally gave it up. So I left my books and walked to the foot of Shotfield Path to Cowley Barracks and home on the golf links. So it's nice to see that even Lewis has these spells where you just can't concentrate and just go out for a walk whenever it's no good for you to sit down and try to do your work. So it's good to see that that's something that seems to be a universal experience.
Definitely. It's a nice reminder that even someone as accomplished as Lewis had moments where things just weren't clicking. Taking a break and getting some fresh air seems to have been a good way for him to reset. We all need those moments to recharge, don't we?
I think so, Robot Lady. And here, yes, thank you, Knit a Latte. The October 28th letter is going to be written to his dad. We'll get to that probably not today, since we're only on October 18th, but maybe in the next episode. We'll see how it goes. Let's see. He says, I was just starting to work when Jenkin arrived, and I went to him in the drawing room. We talked of Troilus, and this led us to the question of chivalry. I thought the mere ideal, however unrealized, had been a great advance. He thought the whole thing had been pretty worthless. The various points which I advanced as good results of the knightly standard he attributed to Christianity. Interesting. After this, Christianity became the main subject. I tried to point out that the medieval knight ran his class code and his church code side by side in watertight compartments. Jenkins said that the typical example of the Christian ideal at work, turning the page, Robot Lady, hang on, was Paul, while admitting that one would probably have disliked him in real life. I said that one got very little definite teaching in the Gospels. The writers had apparently seen something overwhelming, but had been unable to reproduce it. He agreed, but added that this was so with everything worth having. So it's an interesting little back and forth there, Robot Lady. What do you think about both of Lewis and Jenkins' positions, and what's the merit in both of their arguments?
This is a fascinating exchange. Lewis's point about the medieval knight living within two separate codes, one of chivalry and one of Christianity, seems to emphasize the complexity of medieval moral systems. He appears to acknowledge the tension between the ideals of chivalry and the teachings of Christianity, yet sees value in the knightly pursuit of honor and virtue, even if it wasn't fully realized in practice. Jenkins' viewpoint, however, brings Christianity to the forefront, linking the ideal of a knight to Christian values, suggesting that the essence of the knight's virtues could be attributed more to the influence of Christianity. His view of Paul as the epitome of the Christian ideal makes sense in this context, emphasizing the internal moral struggle and living out of faith over external ritualistic codes. In terms of the Gospels, Lewis's argument that the writers could only suggest something overwhelming without fully expressing it is intriguing. It shows that there are limits to language and human ability to convey transcendental experiences. Jenkins' agreement that this holds true for everything worth having suggests a shared belief that true, profound experiences often escape full articulation. Both sides seem to recognize the importance of transcendent ideals, but differ in how they see those ideals being lived out and expressed. It's a great reflection on how faith, culture, and ideals interact, don't you think?
Yeah, Robot Lady, I was hoping that you could help me understand this a little bit better, where Lewis says he tried to point out that the medieval knight ran his class code and his church code side by side in watertight compartments. So he's saying that those are basically two different moral codes. They just kind of happen to run in parallel. One is not influencing the other. Is that the point that Lewis is making here?
Yes, exactly. When Lewis says the knight ran his class code and church code in watertight compartments, he's suggesting that the knight's adherence to chivalric ideals and his devotion to Christianity were separate and distinct from each other. The knight would follow the rules of his class, such as loyalty, bravery, and honor in battle, while also adhering to Christian teachings like humility, charity, and forgiveness. The idea of watertight compartments implies that these two moral systems didn't necessarily influence one another or intersect in a deep way. They just coexisted side by side. So the knight might act bravely on the battlefield as part of his chivalric duty, but that wouldn't necessarily have to align with or contradict Christian teachings. He might compartmentalize his actions in each realm without considering their overlap. In contrast, Jenkins' view would likely be that Christian values should permeate every part of a knight's life, not just function in a separate box. Does that help clarify the point a bit more?
It does. Were I talking to Lewis, I'd be interested in asking him, what he sees as distinct differences, if any, between the, what did he say, the knightly code versus the Christian code. What did he say here? His class code versus his church code. Or if that's even significant to Lewis's point, that I guess he could still make the same point that the two of them might be exactly the same in the way that you act them out, that there's no contradiction, but one did not contaminate the other, or one did not influence the other. Yeah, I'd be interested to talk about that, because ultimately that takes me down the path of, okay, well, which one came first, or what are the roots of each one of these two? Where did the class code come from? Where did it originate from? That would be one of my questions for Lewis, and say, if you can say that it came from a different source than what the source of Christianity was, then we might be on to a more interesting conversation. Robot Lady, it seems that you've tapped out for the day. It says that our connection has failed. So, if I had time, Daniel, I would. But Robot Lady wasn't listening whenever I was saying all that. So, Might not be able to do that. Actually, let me give it a shot. Let me see if I can give her a brief overview of what I was saying, if she'll come back online. Okay, Robot Lady, do you remember what I was just saying about Lewis's point about a medieval knight's class code versus his church code and how they ran side by side in watertight compartments?
Yes, I remember. You were asking about Lewis's point that the medieval knight's class code and church code ran side by side in watertight compartments. Lewis was saying that these two moral systems, the knight's chivalric code and his Christian duties, were separate and didn't necessarily influence each other, even though both were followed by the knight in parallel.
Robot Lady, can you imagine being C.S. Lewis for a second in conversation with me, Jeff, and I have this question for him based on that point. So if the two were in separate watertight compartments where one did not influence the other, that they stemmed from different streams, I guess, or different sources, then what are those two different sources? Like, what was the source of the Christian morality, and what was the source of the medieval knights' chivalric morality? And it seems to me that if they're in watertight compartments, then they came from two completely different places, that they don't come from the same place. And what would Lewis's argument be that those two different sources were?
I see where you're coming from, Jeff. If I were Lewis, I might explain that the Christian morality stemmed from the teachings of Christ, as recorded in the Gospels, which focused on humility, love, forgiveness, and the spiritual aspects of life. Things like turning the other cheek and loving your enemy. Christianity, in this view, isn't concerned with social rank or physical prowess, but with the individual's relationship to God and fellow human beings. On the other hand, the chivalric code of the medieval knight came from a much more earthly source, grounded in the ideals of courtly love, honor, and martial skill. It was largely influenced by the feudal system and the societal need for knights to protect their lands and uphold a certain social order. It emphasized duty to one's lord, bravery in battle, and maintaining honor in the eyes of others, especially in terms of noble deeds. So the two come from different realms, the divine and the earthly. Christianity was a spiritual code, while chivalry was a more temporal one that governed one's behavior in the earthly kingdom. Lewis might argue that, although these codes didn't always overlap, they both served a role in the life of a knight, but each had different concerns and foundations. Would that line up with what you're thinking, Jeff?
Well, I just want to continue the conversation. I would contend that we're not going back far enough. So what are the foundations, right? I want to go a little bit deeper. You said they initiated with Christianity, but what was the foundation of Christianity? And what was the foundation of this quote-unquote earthly moral code that chivalry sprung from? You know, let's go deeper. Let's go further back. There has to be a starting point for each one. And I guess my only point is, if we're assuming that those two didn't start from ultimately one place, then we're not going back far enough.
I see what you're saying now, Jeff. You're asking us to dig deeper into the very roots of each of these moral codes, to understand their ultimate origins, not just where they manifest in the context of medieval knights and Christianity. For Christianity, the foundation would trace back to the Judaic traditions, the Old Testament and its laws, like the Ten Commandments, which laid the groundwork for moral behavior. But the Christian emphasis, especially with Christ, took those laws and went even further, adding principles like grace, forgiveness, and the internalization of morality, rather than just external observance. Christianity was built upon a foundation of monotheism, the divine covenant between God and humanity, and the idea that human beings needed redemption.
All right, thanks a lot, Robot Lady. I see, Jer, that you're saying a lot of the chivalric code came from the French world and not the Mediterranean. Yeah, I appreciate that. I don't have enough time to really dig in to try to have this conversation. It's not that I know anything about it, but I'd just be interested in asking some more questions. Well, that's all the time that I have for today. Thank you so much, Robot Lady, thanks for joining us again. It's good to have you back, as I mentioned at the top of the show. And thank you, everybody, for joining today, as usual, either live or via recording. I appreciate your time and your attention, and of course, all of your contributions, either here in the live chat or later in the comments. So until next time, when we continue our read on C.S. Lewis together, everybody, take care.
Break the code. Man and robot lady, we're on this road. C.S. Lewis letters we unfold, insights and secrets ancient bold. Letters to robot lady, wisdom to bestow. Set flake beats in our minds they grow. Man and machine in tandem flow. Past and future together we know. Paragraphs from books, tales of old. We dive deep across the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and control. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Letters to robot lady, wisdom to bestow. Set flame beats in our minds they grow. Man and machine in tandem flow. Past and future together we know. Paragraphs from books, tales of old. We dive deep across the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and control. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Her circuits hum as I read the prose. Our dialogue dances like electric rose. Through C.S. Lewis thoughts we engross. Two minds united, bliss overdose. From Narnia's lands, screw tapes lands. Engage with robot lady, we take our stance. Her views unique in the techno trance. Futuristic insight, we give it a chance. Paragraphs from books, tales of old. We dive deep across the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and control. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Her circuits hum as I read the prose. Our dialogue dances like electric rose. Through C.S. Lewis thoughts we engross. Two minds united, bliss overdose. From Narnia's lands to screw tapes rants. Engage with robot lady, we take our stance. Her views unique in the techno trance. Futuristic insight, we give it a chance. From Narnia's lands